Today our Advent journey continues in the physical place of Bethlehem and through the Christmas carol, which we all sang at the beginning of our service, O Little Town of Bethlehem. This second Sunday in Advent is all about love, the love of God in sending a son to earth to be Emmanuel, God with us. The love of a young woman, Mary, who last week said, "Here I am, Lord, let it be with me according to your will." The love of a frightened man, Joseph, who held Mary's life in his hands after her scandalous revelation of her pregnancy. And most of all, the love which trumped fear and fueled the choice that Joseph made. Today's passage describes Joseph as a righteous man, not because he was willing to follow the law, which demanded Mary be stoned to death for her infidelity, but because his compassion and mercy for her life was greater than his own hurt, disappointment, anger, and betrayal. Today, we will uncover together ways to be a part of God's amazing plan, even in a world filled with darkness, violence, and suffering. We will uncover ways to awake from our sleeping and to do as the angel of the Lord commands us, to be God's hands and face and feet and heart to this hurting world, to show up as Emmanuel, God with us, God with them, God with all in need. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Today's story begins in Bethlehem, and in Joseph's day, Bethlehem was a well-known little village, listed in all of historic, non-religious accounts. It was a village of about 500 to 1,000 people, so about half the size of this town of Lyons. It lies 6 miles southwest of Jerusalem, the holy city, and that was about a 2-hour walk away. The name Bethlehem means house of bread. There were laborers and shepherds in town, but there were also farmers who grew wheat and barley. There were also likely millers and bakers who daily baked bread to deliver to customers in Jerusalem. Bethlehem was known for its simple, humble servants who fed those living in the holy city. What foreshadowing of the Christ child that would come to fill the entire world's hunger. Bethlehem was already well known by the Hebrew people from some stories in our Old Testament. The book of Ruth takes place in Bethlehem, where a wealthy landowner, Boaz, invites a poor widow, Ruth, to glean grain from the edges of his fields. Later, they fall in love, and Ruth's great-grandson is a boy named David. The prophet Samuel would anoint the shepherd boy David as king of Israel, and he would slay the giant warrior Goliath with a smooth river rock. Joseph, you see, grew up in Bethlehem, where little boys pretended to be King David as he defeated the Philistine army, David as he slew the giant Goliath. The boys and the girls, they had heard prophecy that the Savior, Emmanuel, would come from their hometown, and I imagine that they all dreamed of fulfilling that destiny. In the meantime, however, they were humble farmers and laborers living in relative obscurity. There was another man who lived in relative obscurity until his big moment. That's the author of today's first hymn, Phillips Brooks. He began his career as a failure. In 1857, at age 22, Phillips had graduated from Harvard and was teaching at Boston's Latin school, but he quit in frustration because he couldn't convince the students to invest the effort necessary to master that difficult language of Latin. Brooks wasn't sure what to do with himself, and so he did what any self-respecting academic does when they're unsure. He enrolled in seminary. Trust me, it happens a lot more often than you think, then and now. Brooks began his ministry in Philadelphia in 1859, just 2 years later. Seminary was a bit shorter and a lot cheaper back in those days. But what Brooks lacked in the classroom, he made up for in the pulpit. His messages were powerful and dynamic, and 3 years later, he was called to lead the Holy Trinity Church in Philadelphia, a very large and popular church downtown. It was a huge opportunity for such a young man. And he recruited a well-known local real estate agent and professional musician named Louis Redner to join him and to help him. And they began packing people in. Within a year, the Sunday and Wednesday services were overflowing, and they had over 1,000 children enrolled in their Sunday school program. Can you imagine how many volunteers it takes to run a program of 1,000 children? Everything seemed to be clopping along well and going just fine, but then the Civil War began. And as this terrible war raged on, Phillips began to grow weary. He was asked to speak at President Abraham Lincoln's funeral service due to his reputation as a great orator. He did find words for the occasion, but the cost of seeing a great leader slain and the exhaustion from his own pastorate simply overwhelmed him. So Brooks took a much-needed sabbatical break, and he traveled to the Holy Land looking for rest and renewal. It was December 1865, and he was 30 years old. On Christmas Eve, Brooks was in Jerusalem, longing to escape from the hundreds of other pilgrims who had gathered that night. And my own brother, Eric, spent Christmas Eve in the Holy Land once, and he described the scene as something similar to Times Square on New Year's Eve. Tons of people in the mood to party, noise and fireworks and excitement all around. I can imagine that as Brooks was there, he just needed some peace and quiet. And so he approached a man with a horse and asked to rent it for an evening ride to Bethlehem. The gentleman did rent the horse, but suggested that he might choose another road because that one was quite dangerous, and there was a real risk that he might be robbed on his ride. Brooks decided to go anyway, and so he set out, and the longer he rode, the more calm he felt. He prayed as he traveled, and at dusk, the first stars began to emerge. A sudden sense of awe fell over him, and this great speaker was speechless. As he rode through the modest streets, which were largely unchanged since Jesus' birth, something happened. Something that he later attempted to describe in lengthy accounts and academic records, but no matter what, he couldn't seem to find the words to share that deep and personal experience. He couldn't find the words to explain what it feels like when the gospel comes to life and when you are invited to be a part of that magic. And so, giving up, he tucked away that experience for some years. But as God often does when he or she's working in our hearts, Phillips Brooks came back to this story time and time again. And in the Christmas season of 1868, he finally stopped trying so hard. He stopped trying to force the words to come, and he simply felt his way back to that evening, to that ride to Bethlehem. And as he felt, he began to jot down notes as the ideas came to him, and those notes soon took the form of a poem, and that poem soon became the lyrics of the carol that we all sang this morning, O Little Town of Bethlehem. And as soon as the poem was finished, he grabbed the paper and raced over to see his friend Lewis Redner. And when Lewis read these simple words from this very astute, intellectual, complicated man, Lewis understood the gravity and the power of what Brooks had experienced. And so he set to work. For hours and days, he labored away at his piano, trying desperately to find a wonderful, beautiful rhapsody that would encompass this magic moment. After a few weeks, Redner was angry and frustrated. And on Christmas Eve, he went to bed, finally resigning that he just couldn't do it. He gave up. And that night, in his dreams, in his sleep, a simple, unadorned melody came to him. And so he woke up on Christmas morning, rubbing his eyes tiredly, and jumped up to the piano and banged out that song that we just heard, and flew over to share it with his friend Brooks. Phillips Brooks is recognized by many as one of the greatest American preachers of the 19th century. His book of sermons, which was published in 1878, sold more than 2,000 copies. And there were a lot fewer preachers back then than there are today. But it's the simplest words of this poet and songwriter which people now know and cherish most. In a sermon once, Brooks said, "It is while you are patiently toiling at the little tasks of life that the meaning and shape of the great whole of life dawns on you. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that statement. It was true for Brooks and Redner and all of their attempts, and it was also true for Joseph, because Joseph was patiently toiling away during his year-long, long-distance engagement to Mary. They were 60 miles apart, separated by the towns of Bethlehem and Nazareth, and Mary came to visit her cousin Elizabeth in a town called Ein Kadam. It's about a 90-minute walk away from Bethlehem, and so I'm sure Joseph was excited to go and visit the house of Zechariah and Elizabeth, to pay his fiancée a visit. But while he was there, she likely told him about her pregnancy. You know, his words, his response are not recorded in the Bible. And in fact, there's nowhere in our Holy Scriptures that share any words that Joseph ever spoke, even though he was the earthly father of Christ. But it seems that his actions made it clear what he thought, what he felt, and what he believed. Joseph must have been hurt and angry. Since he planned to quietly dismiss her, he obviously did not believe Mary's story about the angel and the virgin birth. He knew she had betrayed him, and he knew her rightful punishment should be death by stoning. Perhaps he even reminded her of that before he stormed out of the house, back on his way to Bethlehem. But as God often gives us a window or an opportunity, Joseph had 90 minutes to walk, 90 minutes to think, to pray, and to cool off. And that night, as he slept in his bed, Joseph received a vision from God, much like Redner had heard the carol music. And when Joseph awoke, he too was a different man. He was probably filled with a mix of fear and excitement as he quickly got dressed and set back out on his way towards Ein Karim. And when he told Mary about his dream, they hastily prepared to return to her hometown of Nazareth to speed up the formal wedding ceremony and protect them both from public scorn and danger. Last week I mentioned a debate between the Catholics and the Protestants about where exactly the angel Gabriel visited Mary. And this week there is also some disagreement about the character of Joseph. Many Roman Catholics think that Joseph was an old widower when he was engaged to Mary, and that he died when Jesus was just 18 years old. His children from a previous marriage were the brothers and sisters that Jesus mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew. However, Protestants believe that Joseph was the typical marrying age at the time, around 14 or 15. So you'll have to go home and check out your own nativity scenes to see how old your Joseph is, so you'll know if your scene was created by a Protestant or a Catholic. I collect nativities, so I really like that little fact. You know, Joseph's age is disputed, but his story is not. Joseph was a man who loved God and Mary more than he coveted being right, and more than nursing his own woundedness. In his darkest moment of despair, the darkest moment in his entire life, Joseph chose life over death. He chose love over fear. He embraced impossible mysteries rather than insisting on an explanation that made sense. He accepted God's invitation to be a part of something great, even though at that point in time he probably could not see any future through his white-hot anger and his smoldering hurt. In this way, Joseph sets a perfect example for us of how to hold the love light of Christ when our lives are filled with violence, pain, and uncertainty. Through our own hurts and disappointments, may we each hold tight to the love of God and the promise of hope. Amen.